At the previous level, we saw how isolation gradually shrinks the world until only one voice remains the loudest. Tonight, we go deeper, because once the world has become small enough, beliefs no longer need to be broken. They only need to be exhausted. Not through pain, not through force, but through depletion. Carl Gustav Jung understood this mechanism profoundly. He knew that the human psyche has a finite capacity to endure. When psychic energy runs low, the ego stops resisting, not because it has been convinced, but because it no longer has the strength to maintain distance. Jung wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium. When forced to remain tense for too long within a space impoverished of contrast, the psyche chooses the path that consumes the least energy, accepting what is present. This exhaustion is not loud. It grows out of nights of shallow sleep, from constant vigilance, from conflicts that are never spoken aloud. In a world that is already narrowed, every small fluctuation is amplified. Every uncertainty drains more strength. And then, at some point, old beliefs are no longer defended because they are true, but because there is no longer the energy to defend them." Jung warned, "People do not have ideas. Ideas have people." What? When consciousness is fatigued, ideas no longer need to argue to take hold. They remain because it is easier. What is subtle is this: belief change in a state of exhaustion feels reasonable. It feels like setting down a heavy object rather than having something taken away. There is no shock, only relief. Jung clearly distinguished between awakening and relief. Awakening requires energy to see from multiple angles. Relief comes from reducing the number of angles that must be seen. In exhaustion, relief is easily mistaken for clarity. Jung wrote a pivotal sentence: "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Exhaustion makes the work of bringing things to consciousness feel too costly. And so, new interpretations, better aligned with the narrowed structure, quietly replace the old ones. No one forces them. No one commands them. They are simply easier to hold. Here, beliefs are not destroyed. They are reshaped. What once required examination is now kept because it stabilizes the nervous system. Jung called this identification. When the ego merges with a structure that provides immediate balance, he warned, identification with the object is the greatest obstacle to individuation. Individuation requires energy to separate. Exhaustion makes us cling. But Jung did not condemn this process. He saw it as a survival reflex. When there is no longer enough strength to fight or to question, the psyche chooses rest. And rest, in the darkness of constriction, easily turns into belief. Belief not because it is true, but because it is bearable. Tonight, what is needed is not resistance. Jung did not advise forcing awakening when the nervous system is weary. He invited something gentler, a quiet recognition. If beliefs are changing shape, ask whether they are arising from clarity or from exhaustion. That question does not demand an immediate answer. It only creates a small space to breathe. Because when there is space to breathe, energy can return. And when energy returns, critical distance returns as well. For Jung, that is the true beginning of inner freedom. Not overthrowing beliefs, but restoring the strength to see. And when belief begins to grow weary, when resistance dissolves not because it has been defeated, but because it has run out of strength, a more subtle phase quietly opens, one in which change unfolds under the guise of ordinary life. Brainwashing rarely appears brutal. There are no chains, no threats, no visible violence. In fact, nothing looks extreme. Life goes on. Days pass. Meals, familiar work, repetitive conversations. And precisely because nothing seems dramatic, the mind does not resist. It assumes it is safe. because safety, as the nervous system experiences it, is often measured by familiarity rather than by truth. Carl Gustav Jung understood very clearly why the most insidious forms of harm often wear the mask of normalcy. He wrote, "The greatest danger to the psyche is the lack of consciousness. When there are no obvious signs of threat, consciousness does not switch into alert mode. And when consciousness falls asleep, the unconscious takes over the task of orientation." Jung emphasized, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The most effective brainwashing does not need force. It lets the unconscious do the rest. Ordinary days become fertile ground for reshaping belief. Because within a steady, repetitive rhythm, repetition itself turns into evidence. A sentence heard often enough begins to invite fewer questions. An interpretation repeated consistently seems to require less verification, not because it is true, but because it doesn't create friction. Jung warned, people do not have ideas. Ideas have people. When an idea lives with us long enough inside everyday routines, it stops being an idea to examine. It becomes the frame through which reality is lived. What is subtle here is the absence of violation. Instead, there is a feeling of stability. Life feels fine. And fine is one of the most powerful lullabies for the mind. Jung called this a false equilibrium, a state in which the psyche feels calm because it is no longer being challenged. The psyche seeks equilibrium, he wrote, but equilibrium is not the same as clarity. When balance is achieved by removing contrast, consciousness loses the tension it needs to discriminate. It receives, not because it believes, but because it sees no reason to doubt. In this context, repetition does not need intensity. It only needs consistency. Day after day, no climax, no shock. The absence of drama convinces the mind that it is safe. And once safety is assumed, critical energy drops. Jung wrote, "Consciousness needs opposites." But a smoothly repetitive life blurs opposites. When there is no friction, no resistance, no counter voice, suggestion begins to feel like truth. Jung also observed that in this state, the ego easily identifies with whatever conserves energy. He warned, identification with the object is the greatest obstacle to individuation. Individuation, becoming oneself, requires distance and effort. But brainwashing through normalcy exploits exhaustion. It makes distance feel costly and identification feel effortless. The Stoics recognized a parallel mechanism through ethics. Epictetus said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." Growth requires tolerating friction. But when life flows smoothly, friction is avoided as unnecessary risk. And when risk disappears, the capacity for choice thins out. Not because it is forbidden, but because it is no longer practiced. Brainwashing, then, does not need to change the content of life. It only needs to shape the rhythm. Steady rhythm soothes. Soothing leads to sleep. Sleep leads to acceptance. Jung reminds us, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Here, the darkness is not violence. It is unexamined normality. When that darkness remains unconscious, it operates quietly and enduringly. Tonight, what matters is not distrusting everything, nor cultivating fear. Jung did not advocate paranoia. He invited gentle vigilance. If everything feels fine, to the point that no questions arise, ask softly. Fine because of clarity, or fine because of repetition? Fine because of freedom, or fine because of exhaustion? And when ordinary life has lulled vigilance to sleep, when steady repetition replaces friction, an ancient mechanism of the mind quietly takes control. Repetition. The human brain is a pattern-seeking machine. It was not designed to doubt everything, because if we had to re-examine every signal, survival would be impossible. When we hear something once, the mind still questions it. When we hear it twice, it considers it. But when we hear it countless times, it accepts it. Not because it agrees, but because repetition creates familiarity. And familiarity, according to survival instinct, is labeled as safety. From safety, the mind takes one small but dangerous step further. It confuses familiarity with truth. Carl Gustav Jung warned precisely about this blind spot of consciousness. He wrote, "The greatest danger to the psyche is the lack of consciousness. When an idea is repeated long enough without reflection, it no longer stands before consciousness as a hypothesis to be examined. It sinks into the unconscious. And there, it no longer feels like an idea. It feels like reality itself." Jung was explicit. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. When repetition operates in the unconscious, we do not call it influence. We call it the way things simply are. What is subtle is that this acceptance does not require persuasion. It does not need sharp arguments or compelling evidence. It needs time and steady rhythm. A sentence repeated often enough becomes less questioned. An interpretation repeated daily becomes less examined, not because it is more correct, but because the brain conserves energy by trusting what is familiar. Jung once observed, "People do not have ideas. Ideas have people." When an idea is repeated evenly within everyday life, it ceases to be something we possess. It becomes something that possesses us. Repetition does something else as well. It wears down the reflex of critical thinking. The first time you hear something, critique still arises. The 10th time, critique grows tired. The 100th time, critique falls silent. Jung understood that consciousness requires energy to maintain critical distance. He wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium." When repetition offers a sense of stability, the psyche chooses balance over the tension of questioning. And so, truth is no longer tested through comparison. It is felt through familiarity. Here, the danger does not lie in the specific content of the idea, but in the mechanism itself. Even a good idea can become harmful when it is no longer reflected upon. Jung clearly distinguished between the vitality of consciousness and the rigidity of belief. Living consciousness needs opposites. Frozen belief needs repetition. He wrote, "Consciousness needs opposites. When opposites disappear, because no one speaks differently anymore, because no other experience exists for comparison, repetition becomes the sole standard." Familiarity also carries a biological advantage. It calms the nervous system. When something is familiar, the body relaxes. And when the body relaxes, the brain labels it as safe. Jung knew that biological safety can be mistaken for psychological truth. We believe not because we have examined, but because we no longer feel tense when believing. And when a belief makes us less exhausted, it is easily kept. Jung called the result of this process the autonomy of complexes. He wrote, "Complexes are autonomous psychic entities. A complex formed from repeatedly reinforced ideas and emotions begins to operate independently. It selectively gathers information to strengthen itself. It magnifies supporting evidence and blurs counterexamples. And because it functions unconsciously, we do not experience it as bias. We experience it as I see reality clearly." The Stoics warned of a similar danger in ethical language. Epictetus said, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." Judgments repeated long enough become reflexes, and reflexes, when no longer examined, begin to govern behavior. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, "If anyone can refute me, Show me I'm making a mistake or looking at things from the wrong perspective. I'll gladly change. But repetition removes the conditions for refutation. When dialogue disappears, judgments are not corrected. They harden. What is most unsettling is that this acceptance feels voluntary. No one forces us to believe. We believe because we have heard it so many times. We believe because everyone says it. We believe because the surrounding silence confirms it. Jung warned that this is the moment when consciousness becomes identified with its contents. Identification with the object is the greatest obstacle to individuation. When we no longer distinguish ourselves from the ideas we hold, questioning them begins to feel like betraying ourselves. Yet Jung did not advise living in perpetual skepticism. He did not advocate destroying all beliefs. He invited a more humble practice, periodic reflection, bringing what is familiar back into the light of consciousness. Asking again, not to reject, but to locate, Jung wrote. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The darkness here is not something evil. It is the beliefs that have become so familiar that they are no longer seen. And when repetition has grown familiar to the ear, the eye, the nervous system, the next step no longer lies in content, but in the rhythm of the mind. Repetition alone is not enough. The psyche still needs energy in order to question. Carl Gustav Jung understood that reflection is not merely an intellectual act, it is an energetic state. When that energy declines, questions are not forbidden, they simply disappear. And so, the rhythm begins to shift. Not loudly, not abruptly, only through changes so small they never trigger alarm. Sleep becomes lighter. Not quite insomnia, just an inability to sink deeply. Rest shortens. You wake without truly being restored. Thoughts begin to fragment. Difficulty sustaining focus. Difficulty holding a long line of reasoning. Jung noted that consciousness requires rhythm to maintain clarity. When that rhythm is bent, consciousness dulls long before it vanishes. These changes are not obvious, only subtly off. And it is precisely this subtlety that makes them effective. There is no emergency signal demanding resistance, no pain sharp enough to force a stop. Jung wrote, "The greatest danger to the psyche is the lack of consciousness." When fatigue unfolds in a gray zone, consciousness does not recognize it as threat. It experiences it as normal life. When the mind is tired, it no longer analyzes. Analysis requires holding multiple variables, tolerating contradiction, sustaining attention over time. In a state of mild but prolonged exhaustion, the psyche chooses the most economical path, simplification. Jung described this as a self-preserving reflex of the ego. The psyche seeks equilibrium. When complexity creates strain, simplicity offers balance, even if that balance is impoverished. Simplification is not stupidity, it is survival. One story replaces many possibilities. One voice replaces many dialogues. One explanation replaces many perspectives. And because it reduces effort, it is retained. Jung warned, people do not have ideas. Ideas have people. In a fatigued state, simple ideas do not win by argument. They win by lightness. What is especially important to notice is this. This exhaustion does not need to be produced violently. It can arise from compressed schedules, prolonged stress, the constant demand to be okay. When rest is shortened long enough, the capacity for doubt weakens. And when doubt weakens, even thin beliefs become difficult to dislodge. Jung wrote a pivotal sentence, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." When exhaustion operates unconsciously, we do not call it fatigue, we call it I don't want to think anymore. And in that moment, simplification begins to feel like clarity. But Jung does not condemn this state. He understands that a tired mind needs rest, not coercion. What he invites is something gentler, a recognition. If thinking is shortening, if questions are disappearing, it may not be because everything has become clear, but because you are too tired to keep them open. And when the rhythm of the mind has been bent, when shallow sleep and fragmented thinking become the new normal, what changes next is not belief itself, but the standard by which the mind now judges reality. An exhausted mind seeks only one thing: relief, not truth, not meaning, but calm. Carl Gustav Jung understood that this longing is not weakness. It is a survival reflex. When psychic energy is depleted, the ego stops pursuing what is right and begins pursuing what hurts less. And relief comes fastest through agreement, through nodding, through letting things pass without resistance. Jung wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium. The psyche seeks balance before it seeks truth." When tension persists for too long, balance is no longer achieved through reflection or comparison, but through the reduction of conflict. And in a state of fatigue, reducing conflict means lowering the threshold for critique, not because the mind has been convinced, but because it no longer has the strength to maintain distance. This relief is deeply persuasive. It arrives immediately. It requires no argument, no evidence, only surrender. Jung warned of this moment when he wrote, "People do not have ideas. Ideas have people." When consciousness is exhausted, simple ideas, especially those that promise calm, do not need to argue their way in. They remain because they conserve energy. The Stoics understood this clearly from an ethical perspective. They believed that clarity requires inner order, an order that allows us to distinguish what lies within our control from what does not. Epictetus wrote, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." Improvement requires enduring friction, but exhaustion dissolves that inner order. When fatigue lasts long enough, friction becomes unbearable. And the mind, in order to survive, changes its goal, from clarity to comfort. In this state, agreement does not feel like betrayal of the self, it feels like self-care. Don't think anymore. Don't question anymore. Just let it be. Jung would call this a false rest, a rest that does not restore, but freezes. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When resignation operates unconsciously, we do not call it exhaustion, we call it reality. The danger is not in seeking calm, it is in lowering the standard. When fatigue persists, the mind lowers its criteria for what it accepts as true. Truth is no longer what has been carefully examined, it is what soothes. Truth no longer needs to be durable, it only needs to be sufficient to get through the day. Jung drew a clear distinction between living truth and soothing certainty. Living truth opens outward, soothing certainty closes inward. Marcus Aurelius reminded us, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." But that power requires energy to operate. When energy runs out, power does not disappear. It goes dormant. And when power lies dormant, comfortable choices begin to masquerade as reasonable ones. Jung called this identification with a state, when the ego merges with the need for calm and mistakes it for wisdom. He warned, identification with the object is the greatest obstacle to individuation. Individuation, becoming oneself, requires the strength to stand apart. Exhaustion causes us to cling instead. The calm achieved through constant agreement has one defining feature. It is quiet. No arguments, no conflict, no dissent. And precisely because of that, it is favored by the nervous system. But the Stoics reminded us that calm is not the same as peace. Seneca wrote, "A calm sea does not make a skilled sailor. Stillness does not train judgment. Inner order does." When inner order collapses under fatigue, quiet becomes a disguise. Jung did not advise fighting exhaustion with willpower. He understood that forcing wakefulness when the mind is depleted only creates more tension. Instead, he invited a different movement: naming. Recognizing that present agreement comes from the need for calm, not from clarity. Recognizing that standards have been lowered due to overload, not because everything is suddenly clear. Naming alone begins to restore order, not through resistance, but through awareness. Epictetus said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." But when one is exhausted, the first step is not action. It is true rest. Rest that restores the capacity to discern. Jung believed that many deep integrations occur when the nervous system is allowed to settle. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The darkness here is silent exhaustion, and once it is seen, it loses its secret control." So tonight, there is no need to fight fatigue with grand declarations. Only a small recognition is enough. If I am nodding simply to feel calm, perhaps I need to restore inner order before adopting new beliefs. That recognition demands no immediate action. It simply opens space for energy to return and for discernment to breathe again. And when the calm achieved by nodding along has become a habit, when compliance wears the mask of a reasonable choice, the deepest layer of this process truly begins. The place where consciousness is no longer the main door. Jung observed that the unconscious does not argue. It does not debate. It does not demand evidence. It absorbs. Carl Gustav Jung wrote, "The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good. But precisely because the unconscious does not distinguish good and evil through reasoning, it becomes fertile ground for whatever enters when consciousness weakens. When reflective energy is depleted, when questions fall silent, ideas slip in quietly, not through the front gate, not through inspection, like familiar guests. These ideas do not force their way in. They seep." Jung understood that the unconscious works through images, sensations, and repetition. The unconscious speaks in symbols, he reminded us. And the most powerful symbol of belief is not a command, but a subjective experience. The feeling of, I realized this myself. When consciousness is tired, the unconscious takes in ready-made patterns and weaves them into intuition. No confrontation, no argument, no awakening required. The subtle danger is this: ideas that enter while consciousness is weakened no longer feel imposed. They feel self-discovered. Jung called this phenomenon identification, when unconscious content is experienced as one's own voice. He warned, people do not have ideas. Ideas have people. When an idea is absorbed by the unconscious, it does not appear as a belief to be examined. It appears as, this is how I think. And because it carries a personal stamp, it becomes extremely difficult to question. This is how beliefs are rewritten without confrontation, without conflict, without awakening. Jung wrote the crucial line, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When rewriting happens in the unconscious, we do not call it change. We call it maturity, clarity, obvious truth. The unconscious does not convince us that it is right. It makes us forget that other ways of seeing ever existed. In this state, consciousness is not defeated. It is resting, but in a way that doesn't restore. Jung distinguished between restorative rest and numbing rest. Restorative rest creates space for reflection to return. Numbing rest freezes questions. And when questions are frozen, the unconscious continues to absorb, organize, and normalize the ideas already inside. The Stoics touched the same truth from an ethical angle. Epictetus said, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. When judgments are formed without awareness, they become reflexes, and reflexes, repeated long enough, become character." Jung would say this is when a complex begins to operate autonomously. Complexes are autonomous, psychic entities. Once a belief complex has been absorbed into the unconscious, it selects experiences to sustain itself and filters out what threatens it, even before consciousness can intervene. The most frightening part is not being forced to believe, but believing with a sense of freedom. Jung understood that the unconscious is very skilled at generating a sense of sovereignty. When an idea is experienced as a personal discovery, it is defended by identity itself. At that point, disagreement is no longer a difference of opinion. It feels like an attack. Jung warned, identification with the object is the greatest obstacle to individuation. When we identify ourselves with a belief, stepping back to look at it becomes painful, not intellectually, but emotionally. And so, no dramatic awakening is required. The unconscious prefers to work in the dark. It thrives when life flows smoothly, when rhythms repeat, when exhaustion is normalized. Jung wrote, "The greatest danger to the psyche is the lack of consciousness. Lack of awareness is not stupidity, it is the absence of light. And when light is absent, darkness does not need to be violent. It simply exists." But Jung was not pessimistic. He believed that simply naming this process is already an opening. Not arguing with every idea, but recognizing the mechanism. Recognizing that this feels obvious to me may come from absorption, not examination. Recognizing that the feeling of, "I discovered this myself," may be the product of an unconscious shaped by fatigue. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The darkness here is quiet absorption. The Stoics would add a final reminder. Inner order requires steady practice of awareness, not explosive awakenings. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If anyone can refute me, show me I'm making a mistake or looking at things from the wrong perspective, I'll gladly change." That statement assumes one thing still exists, the capacity to be refuted. When the unconscious has rewritten belief without confrontation, that capacity must be restored through genuine rest, through safe comparison, through reopening space for doubt. So tonight, there is no need to fight what has already been absorbed. Jung did not advise shattering beliefs by force of will. He invited a gentler movement, bringing light back. Light not to judge, but to see. When light enters, the unconscious no longer holds exclusive power, and when that monopoly dissolves, consciousness has a chance to return to the table. Quietly, without drama. Imagine walking for hours without rest. At first, you choose the path. You observe, weigh, and decide. Each turn is a conscious act. But over time, your legs grow heavy, your breathing becomes uneven, and the only question left inside you is no longer, "Which way is right?" It becomes, "How can I avoid stopping?" Eventually, you follow whatever path appears, not because it is right, but because stopping feels more unbearable than continuing. Carl Gustav Jung would say, "This is the moment consciousness withdraws, yielding control to the automatic mechanisms of the psyche." This is what prolonged exhaustion does to the mind. It does not persuade. It erodes. Jung understood that willpower and reflection are not infinite resources. He wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium. When tension exceeds what can be endured, the psyche does not search for truth. It searches for balance, even if that balance is impoverished. And in exhaustion, the fastest balance is simply to keep moving, regardless of direction." At first, choice is still choice. Later, choice turns into inertia. Jung clearly distinguished conscious action from behavior driven by the unconscious. When reflective energy declines, the unconscious does not need to convince. It takes over. He warned, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When you walk because stopping feels intolerable, you do not call it loss of freedom. You call it just how life is. This erosion happens quietly. There is no collapse. Only moments when questions are skipped. Moments when you choose faster. Moments when acceptance becomes easier. Jung once observed, "People do not have ideas. Ideas have people." When exhaustion persists, simple ideas, familiar paths, and less painful choices begin to have you. Not because they are true, but because they require less effort. In this state, stopping to think becomes a luxury. Stopping means facing fatigue, confusion, emptiness, sensations an overloaded nervous system does not want to feel. So you keep going, and repeated movement creates a dangerous illusion, the illusion of progress. Jung would say this is where the ego mistakes motion for meaning. But motion without direction is only drifting. Jung understood this mechanism deeply when he spoke of identification. Identification with the object is the greatest obstacle to individuation. When you identify yourself with the path you are on, whatever that path may be, you no longer stand outside it to observe. You no longer ask, "Why am I walking?" You only ask, "How do I keep going?" Individuation, becoming yourself, requires pauses. Exhaustion makes pauses unbearable. The Stoics saw this long ago as well. Epictetus warned, "No man is free who is not master of himself." But mastery of the self is not merely controlling action. It is the ability to stop and judge. When exhaustion persists, that capacity dissolves. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it." In exhaustion, we no longer have the energy to examine our estimates. We accept them as default. Erosion does something else. It lowers standards. The best path becomes the acceptable path. Then acceptable becomes anything will do. Jung called this forced simplification, the psyche reducing complexity to survive. He wrote, "The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good." But when the unconscious takes over in exhaustion, it does not seek what is best. It seeks what is tolerable. The tragic part is that this process does not hurt at first. On the contrary, it brings short-term relief. You no longer have to decide. You no longer have to weigh. You just keep moving. And because that relief arrives at the right moment, it is retained. Jung warned, "The greatest danger to the psyche is the lack of consciousness." Lack of awareness is not stupidity. It is the absence of light when it is needed most. In the image of walking without rest, Jung would not ask, "Where are you going?" He would ask, "Do you still have the strength to stop?" Because stopping, in Jungian psychology, is not failure. It is the condition for choice. Without stopping, there is no choice. Without choice, there is no freedom. And when freedom disappears, it does not vanish through chains. It vanishes through exhaustion. Jung did not advise forcing clarity when one is depleted. He understood that coercion only deepens erosion. Instead, he invited something humbler: recognition. Recognize that following whatever path appears is not because you found truth, but because you are too tired to search. This recognition is not condemnation. It restores the possibility of choice in the future when energy returns. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The darkness here is not error, it is silent erosion. When erosion becomes conscious, it loses its hidden control. You may not stop immediately, but you know you are walking because you are tired. And that knowledge alone is a crack of light. Remember this: not every path you walk while exhausted reflects who you are. Many paths only reflect your energy level at that moment. Jung believed that when energy returns, discernment returns with it. You will choose again. Not hurried, not forced, but conscious. And so, if tonight you are still moving simply because stopping feels too painful, allow yourself one very small act. Acknowledge the exhaustion. You do not need to change direction. You only need to acknowledge it. In that acknowledgement, you have already begun to stop, inwardly. And that is where freedom, according to Jung, always begins. Not with the feet, but with the gaze. And here is the quiet truth. Prolonged exhaustion is the widest open doorway to distorted beliefs. Not because the mind is weak, but because it longs for rest. Carl Gustav Jung saw this with deep compassion. He understood that when psychological energy is depleted, consciousness no longer has the strength to maintain critical distance. And when that distance disappears, whatever enters does not need to be true. It only needs to be less tiring. Jung once wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium. The psyche seeks balance before it seeks truth." When fatigue is prolonged, balance is no longer achieved by holding multiple perspectives or tolerating contradiction. It is achieved by reducing load. Simple beliefs, soothing interpretations, short answers, all become attractive not because of their value, but because they allow the nervous system to settle. What is subtle here is this: distorted beliefs do not need to invade through force. They arrive as temporary support. Jung warned, people do not have ideas. Ideas have people. When an idea appears at the exact moment the mind is exhausted, it is not examined. It is embraced, not because we deeply believe it, but because we need relief. And within that embrace, the idea slowly becomes inner reality. Jung also reminded us, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. When exhaustion operates unconsciously, we do not call it fatigue, we call it life. We do not notice that standards have been lowered, that questions have been postponed, that what once required verification is now accepted because there is no longer energy to ask. This is not a moral failure, it is survival. The Stoics spoke of the same truth in another language. Epictetus wrote, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." But to re-examine judgments, we need inner order. Prolonged exhaustion dissolves that order. When tired long enough, the mind no longer seeks what is right. It seeks what is bearable. And when what is bearable is repeated, it is labeled as truth. In this state, there is nothing to fight against. Fighting requires energy. Jung did not advise resistance when energy is depleted. He invited a different movement: recognition. Recognizing that what is being believed may come from the need for rest, not from clarity. Recognizing that immediate comfort is not the same as enduring truth. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The darkness here is quiet exhaustion. When seen, it loses its hidden power. This recognition does not demand immediate action, does not force you to change beliefs or dismantle the structures that are currently holding you upright. It simply creates a very small distance between you and what you believe. That distance is enough to breathe, enough to stop identifying yourself with a temporary state. Jung warned about identification when he wrote, "Identification with the object is the greatest obstacle to individuation. Individuation, becoming yourself, requires space. Exhaustion removes that space. Recognition restores a small opening. At the next level, we will explore what happens when the mind no longer believes that escape is possible, and obedience begins to feel natural, when choice is no longer experienced as choice, but as what obviously must be done." Jung understood that this is the deepest layer of false freedom, when the ego believes it is choosing, while it is actually avoiding fatigue. But not tonight. Jung held sleep in great respect as a space of healing. He believed that profound integration often occurs when consciousness withdraws, and the unconscious works without coercion. The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good. Rest allows the unconscious to reorganize without strain. So sleep. Sleep is not escape. Sleep is not surrender. Rest is recovery. When the body rests, energy returns. When energy returns, discernment returns. And when discernment returns, beliefs do not need to be destroyed. They are simply placed back where they belong. Jung would say, "Inner freedom does not come from winning an argument, but from restoring the conditions in which awakening can occur." The world does not disappear when you sleep. It waits for you, with more choices, wider horizons, and more space for a mind that has been restored.